Thank you, David. Let me say from the outset that when I received the call from Michael Brown's parents, it was in the context of 2 or 3 major similar cases involving policing. And if you look back over the last several decades, where we've had these explosions that have gone violent, whether it was Watts in the 60s or South Central, it is usually around issues of law enforcement and the communities. My argument is that when people lose faith in those that they really feel are there to protect them, that is when you have your most combative type of forces take over, and that's when you have your explosions. Michael Brown's case happened about 3 weeks after a young man in Staten Island, New York, was killed by a police chokehold. The chokehold itself is illegal in New York against police policy. It was videotaped, shown nationally. A week later, a black female was beaten on the LA freeway by a state highway patrolman who hit her 15 times sitting on her stomach because she was walking down the highway and obviously had some mental health issues. These videos led into when Michael Brown was killed. So there was already a climate of outrage among many around the country. When I got the call, and unlike common thought, I never get involved in cases, nor does National Action Network, without being called in by the victim. I know that the given image is that we are somewhere with walkie-talkies waiting on a problem so we can rush in. But I never heard of Ferguson, Missouri before I got the call. I never heard of Sanford, Florida before Trayvon's parents called me. And when I went in, it was this kind of anger at Michael Brown happening in the context of all of this. The fundamental question becomes how we build a society that can guarantee and enforce equal protection under the law and equal opportunity. As we go into the election with Michael Brown and Ferguson and all that that means, impacting how some races can or cannot be decided, one of the things that we have to do is that many of us want to have to avoid the reality that we still have inequality when it comes to race and gender and sexual orientation in the country at different levels, but still inequality. When we saw the election of Barack Obama as president in 2008, immediately many said we're beyond race now. The election of Barack Obama was tremendous. It was something that showed how far we have come as a country, and we did come a long way. No one in their right mind can deny that journey from 50 years ago next year of the Voting Rights Act guaranteeing all Americans the right to vote, breaking down the walls in the South where blacks couldn't vote to where you'd see a black president. I will never forget when he won, I thought about how my own mother could not vote in her hometown of Dothan, Alabama, until she was 39 years old. And yet, she died a little over 2 years ago. I was able to read a letter of condolence from the first black president of the U.S. at her funeral. That's a long journey the country made. But because we came a long way does not mean that we had completed the journey. I left New York this morning to fly to be here for this tonight. When we got halfway between New York and Chicago, we had turbulence for about a half hour. They told us fasten our seatbelt, stay in our seat, and we did. Then after about 25 minutes, the turbulence subsided. We could take our seatbelts off. We can use whatever restrooms or whatever we wanted to do on the plane. but nobody went and got off the plane because just because the turbulence had settled, we had not arrived at O'Hare. My argument is that the election of President Obama showed that some of the turbulence of the 60s and the 80s had settled, but we had not arrived at the destination of equality. And until we have the courage to finish the trip, there's always going to be Fergusons because we will not solve the bigger problem of equal protection under the law. A study came out just last week. Young black males are 21 times more likely to be shot by police than others. That does not mean that all police are racist, and that does not mean that even most are. But it does mean that we have not developed the capacity of looking at this problem and saying this is a problem that needs to be solved. Now, one of the things that we've said in National Action Network and has been emanating from the battles in Ferguson and Staten Island that are the cases that are now before this nation, is that there must be an intervention by the federal government, by the Justice Department, to deal with national policing policy. Why? Because local political operations get involved with local prosecutions. Prosecutors are elected locally. They depend on local police to gather their evidence. There's an inherent distrust in many of us in local communities that local prosecutors will not be fair and impartial. The federal government does not use local police to gather its evidence. The U.S. attorneys are not elected. So you take the politics and the suggestion of politics out when you're dealing from a more national level. The whole battle around immigration, around voting, around policing, all of these battles are really of the forces that we've seen line up in this country for over the last century. And that is how much we're going to trust state government and how much we need a stronger national government. And a lot of what I would project to you that we're going to see in the last 3 weeks into this election is the real unstated battle of states' rights against a strong national government. When you undermine the credibility of national government and when you undermine its ability, it runs contrary to those of us that felt the only way we got relief was when national government intervened. Let us not forget that it was national government that intervened in the South. It never was that the state of Alabama, the state of Mississippi, or the state of Georgia changed. It was the national government under Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson that came in and dealt with imposing national order. So when you hear arguments that let us deal with voting state by state, let us deal with immigration state by state, and even questions that we're dealing with in policing, some of us hear states' rights. Some of us hear going backwards. And some of us fear that if we deal with it state by state, we're going to end up being the ones that get the short end of the stick. When we deal with these voting laws, all of a sudden, 23 states decide that we need to have new voter ID. And when you get into debates, and I'm sure that some of that may come up in the panel, they will say there's nothing wrong, Reverend, with having ID. Of course there's nothing wrong with having ID. We always had ID. You always had to identify yourself to vote when you would go to the polls. The question that I raised, and the question many in the civil rights community raised, was what's wrong with the ID we always had? What's wrong with the ID we had when we had Nixon in the race, or Jimmy Carter, or Bush Sr., or Clinton, or Bush Jr.? It just seemed perplexing to us that when we get to Obama, now we need some special ID. Well, we've got to stop fraud, but the Bush Justice Department didn't find any fraud, 0.0003% fraud. So you are a solution looking for a problem rather than a problem dealing with a solution. But it has been established by any number of studies. It impacts minorities voting. These are issues of race that will be a driving force in the next 3 weeks. Now, I would say that many people are going to come out and vote because of the impediments. They're going to vote because of Ferguson. They're going to vote because they want to make a statement. We ought to be voting around trying to finish the journey toward what Dr. King called a beloved community. But that can only begin when we all say that we can depend on a government that gives us equal protection and equal opportunity. I did challenge black on black crime and black disrespect of our women and blacks not doing what I feel is the right and constructive things to do, including gun violence right here in Chicago at the funeral of Michael Brown. Why? Because there is the dual battle of fighting the external forces of bias and the internal forces of self-destruction. I was attacked on both sides, and usually you find out that you're most right when both sides find something wrong with what you say. I think that it is important that we have a standard in this country that will cut both ways and challenge what is wrong. But you do not have the credibility to talk to gangbangers in Chicago if you also cannot talk to police that would choke a man while he's saying 11 times, "I can't breathe," and he won't let him go. You cannot tell young people that are in or living on the west side of Chicago that you care about them. Therefore, you're trying to talk to them for their own good, but you don't care about them when they're abused or when you're cutting programs that could train them or jobs that can develop them. You must be able to show a consistency, and you must be able to say to them, you can trust that this system can work for you. I remember a conversation I was having right here in Chicago in the summer of last year. I took an apartment on the west side, worked with Reverend Marshall Hatch and others here around gun violence. And I was saying to them, we've got to get the guns out of the neighborhood, and all of you know people with guns, and we need to get them out. Young man said to me, well, Reverend Al, we can't talk about the guns and our friends. We can't give up our friends. We can't talk to the man. I said, have you seen the Attorney General lately? We are the man. His name is Eric Holder. He looks just like us. We have got to deal with the progress that we've made in the reality of these times. And the reality is that, yes, we've gone a long way. We've come a long way. And people paid a dear price to get us there. But we have not closed the gap. And Ferguson shows there's still a ways to go until we can have equal protection under the law and trust that the system is going to work equally for everyone. We can scapegoat the messengers, but we should not forget the message. It is easy to say that there are those of us in civil rights that exacerbate the tension, and the problems are those of us that talk about it. But if it wasn't me, it'll be somebody else. As long as there's a problem, someone's going to talk about it until the problem is solved. I would hope, as we wrestle with great ideas this week, that we wrestle with the idea of how we finish guaranteeing equal protection under the law and equal opportunity, and we use the models of democracy to do so, starting with this election. I think it is important in the town that gave us our first African-American president that these kind of ideas be discussed. And we understand that just because we've made a long and in some cases tedious journey, we're not home yet, but we can get home if we have the same determination, same sacrifice, and same discipline that our parents and their parents used to get us this far. It was very difficult. Some lost their lives to break through the racial barriers that were before us. It won't take that kind of sacrifice for us, but it will take some courage. It will take some determination, and it will take some sacrifice. I think we can do it because we're the children of those that did it in the first place. I still believe America can be the land of the free and the home of the brave. I just hope that I didn't believe beyond reality. I would hope that I can say that we're making it even more real every day. Thank you, and God bless you.